In 235 AD, at the very heart of Rome, within the opulent halls of the imperial palace, something truly extraordinary was brewing, an event poised to eclipse all previous scandals of antiquity. This was no bloody battle or treacherous political conspiracy, but something far more shocking, capable of shaking the very foundations of Roman civilization, its moral principles, and spiritual tenets. Emperor Maximinus Thrax, renowned for his cruelty and unpredictability, conceived a plan to force his own son to don women's attire and publicly marry him, presenting this spectacle to the Senate and the common people. This tale, corroborated by historical accounts, stands as a stark example of the moral degradation that unchecked power can unleash. It is a narrative of a barbaric emperor whose bestial strength instilled terror, and of his son whose beauty became a fatal curse. It is a story of obsession, paranoia, and moral decay that can ultimately plunge an entire empire into the depths of chaos. Even those who believe they know all about Roman excesses will undoubtedly be astonished by Maximinus's actions, for they defy not only laws, but the very boundaries of civility itself. The Roman Empire in the 3rd century AD was enduring a period of profound crisis, teetering on the brink of collapse. Unceasing civil wars, escalating barbarian incursions along its borders, rampant inflation devaluing currency, and emperors succeeding one another with dizzying speed. These were just some of the harbingers of impending disaster. This era, known to history as the crisis of the 3rd century, became one of the darkest chapters in Rome's annals. What once symbolized order and stability had transformed into an empire gripped by chaos and uncertainty. The Senate had lost its influence, the army dictated who lived and who died, and the common populace suffered from hunger and violence. During this profound crisis, as Rome was torn apart by internal strife and external threats, a man embodying all the fears of the Roman elite emerged onto the historical stage, Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus, a giant from Thrace. He could boast neither noble lineage, nor a brilliant education, nor any reverence for established Roman traditions. His father was a Gothic herdsman, and his mother an Allan. However, Maximinus more than compensated for his lack of aristocracy with qualities Rome could not ignore: untamed strength and ruthless military prowess. While the Roman nobility clung to outdated customs, the legions saw in Maximinus a warrior forged for harsh times, and in a fractured Rome, it was this barbarian who was destined to become emperor. Maximinus was strikingly different from his predecessors. He did not belong to ancient patrician families, had not honed his oratorical skills, nor had he been groomed for imperial power from a young age. His homeland was the wild fringes of the empire, and his primary mentor was war. Standing over 2 meters tall, he was a living mountain of muscle, inspiring awe with his mere presence. His ascent began during the reign of Septimius Severus. In the bloody campaigns against Germanic and British tribes, Maximinus earned the recognition and respect of his soldiers. Legend spoke of his furious endurance in battle, his ability to fight tirelessly for long hours, and to survive wounds that would have been fatal to others. His ferocity in combat was so terrifying that even the barbarians composed songs about him, naming him the Demon of Rome. The decisive episode that altered the course of history occurred during the military campaign on the Rhine in 235 AD. At that time, the Roman throne was occupied by Alexander Severus, a young and inexperienced ruler who was entirely under the influence of his mother, Julia Mamaea. His policy, aimed at resolving conflicts with Germanic tribes through negotiation rather than military action, sparked a wave of indignation among the Roman army. For the battle-hardened legionaries, such an approach was perceived not as foresight, but as shameful cowardice and humiliation. Maximinus, possessing remarkable patience and strategic acumen, awaited the opportune moment. He unerringly determined that his hour had arrived. With incredible physical strength and bestial cunning, he managed to win the favor of the legions, skillfully fanning their discontent with the existing state of affairs and preparing the ground for rebellion. The climax came suddenly and was marked by a brutal massacre. Alexander Severus and his mother were savagely murdered directly in the military camp. For the first time in Rome's annals, a man with not a drop of Roman blood ascended the imperial throne, proclaimed emperor by rebellious soldiers. News of what had transpired plunged the Roman Senate into a state of profound horror. A man who openly disregarded centuries-old traditions, possessing not the slightest understanding of laws and philosophy, now sat at the pinnacle of power. However, halting his ascent proved impossible. The empire fell under the sway of Maximinus Thrax, an emperor whose rule was founded not on noble birth, but on brute force and violence. At that moment, no one could have even imagined that Maximinus's true nature would manifest not in his cruelty on the battlefields, but in the morbid and perverted bond he would establish with his son. From his ascension to the throne, it became evident that young Maximus, the emperor's son, occupied a central place in his thoughts and actions. When Maximus was barely 18, his father bestowed upon him the title of Caesar, declaring him his successor. However, over time, it became clear that this decision was dictated not merely by political expediency, but by a morbid attachment that surpassed ordinary paternal love. Maximus, as if sculpted from an ancient statue, was the complete antithesis of his father. His aristocratic pallor, light curly hair, and graceful figure conformed to Roman ideals of perfect beauty. For any other ruler, such a son would have been a source of pride, but for Maximinus, he became an object of unhealthy obsession. Initially, this manifested as excessive protectiveness. The emperor strictly forbade young men from approaching Maximus, dismissed all male tutors, replacing them with women. Even the selection of bodyguards was subject to the whim of the jealous ruler. Preference was given to those who posed no threat to his morbid love. Subsequently, the obsession extended to the heir's appearance. Maximinus, previously indifferent to matters of fashion, now personally controlled his son's wardrobe and jewelry. He forbade Maximus from wearing traditional male togas and military armor, forcing him into silks and jewels and elaborate feminine hairstyles. Soon, Maximus began to appear in public in attire more befitting a noble Roman lady than the heir to a great empire. In the corridors of power within the Roman Empire, murmurs grew, yet no one dared openly defy the despotic Maximinus. His son Maximus's public appearances caused increasing unease. The young man invariably sat beside his father, who treated him not as a son, but as a priceless trophy, an object of pride. In this lavish yet stifling atmosphere, Maximus gradually withered. His gaze was vacant, His movements lost their vitality, as if he was learning to detach from his own body to endure the daily humiliation. Courtiers whispered as they observed this tragedy. What might have initially seemed like paternal care had transformed into a morbid, all-consuming obsession. And soon, this obsession was to take a step that would shake the entire Roman Empire to its core. The year 237 AD marked the apex of imperial madness. While the empire suffered from incessant revolts and wars, Maximinus made a decision that astonished everyone. In the presence of the Roman Senate, adorned in imperial regalia, he announced his intention to marry. For a moment, a sigh of relief swept through the hall. Senators assumed that the cruel ruler had finally chosen a worthy spouse who would ensure the continuation of the imperial dynasty. However, Maximinus then named his chosen one. She was neither a foreign princess nor a Roman aristocrat. It was his own son Maximus, by then transformed into an effeminate being, presented to the court as the brilliant Maxima. An oppressive silence descended. It seemed the marble walls of the Senate, like a mirror, reflected every word of Maximinus, recalling the sacrilege they had witnessed. Appearing in white bridal robes adorned with pearls and gold, he seemed the embodiment of tragedy. Tears welled in his empty eyes, yet he dared not utter a word of protest. Only old Senator Cornelius Balbus, whose age exceeded 70, dared to break the silence. "Caesar," he exclaimed, "what you intend is incest, sacrilege, and treason before the gods." But his bravery was short-lived. Maximinus, like a predator, swiftly crossed the hall, and, before everyone's eyes, with terrifying brutality, strangled the senator with his own hands. The lifeless body crumpled at his feet. "Are there any further objectors?" the emperor demanded, his hands still stained with blood. In response, only dead silence. The next day, in the Temple of Venus and Roma, a sanctuary for every Roman, the blasphemous wedding took place. But instead of jubilation, an ominous silence pervaded the city. The streets emptied, houses were tightly shut. The people preferred to hide in their homes rather than witness such a monstrous defilement. The pontifex, compelled under threat of death, performed an empty ceremony, his words sounding like a mockery of this imperial union. On that fateful day, the eternal city realized that Maximinus was not merely a despot steeped in autocracy, but a dangerous figure capable of plunging the entire Roman Empire into the abyss of his own madness. The impending reaction would not be long in coming and promised to be devastating. News of the sacrilegious marriage spread across the vast empire like wildfire. What began as a personal act of madness escalated into a monumental crisis, threatening the very foundations of civilization. In the heart of Rome, the Senate seethed with restrained indignation. Political opponents who had been at odds for decades unexpectedly found common ground, an all-consuming horror of the emperor. In clandestine meetings, senators began to discuss the seditious idea of overthrowing Maximinus, even if it meant armed conflict with the army. Even women from high society, zealous guardians of family values and traditions, responded to the challenge with protests. Roman matrons organized a silent boycott, refusing to participate in feasts, ceremonial events, and other imperial functions. Their absence transformed the lavish imperial festivities into soulless and empty spectacles. The common people reacted to the events with a mixture of fear and contempt. In the bustling markets and public baths, Maximinus's name was no longer spoken aloud, but relegated to hushed whispers filled with indignation. Mothers frightened their disobedient children, citing the emperor as a symbol of moral degradation and impending retribution. The decay of power reached a critical juncture when the priesthood openly expressed its displeasure. The College of Pontiffs, guardians of Rome's religious foundations, delivered a severe verdict. Maximinus's marriage violated the sacred Pax Deorum, the harmony between the world of men and the divine order. Augurs, endowed with the gift of interpreting the will of the gods through sacrifices, increasingly encountered ominous omens, as if nature itself had risen against the emperor. Rome, once a bastion of spirituality and morality, found itself stained with defilement. However, the most devastating blow to Maximinus's throne came from within, from the army, the backbone of the empire. Warriors, nurtured on ideals of courage and honor, could not reconcile themselves to their leader, trampling all moral principles by marrying his own son. Centurions, forming the core of the legions, increasingly voiced their outrage, asserting that the emperor had lost his virtues, the valor and virtue essential for rule. Desertion became commonplace, and those who remained refused even to look towards Maximus during military parades and ceremonies. The image of the heir, clad in women's clothing and seated beside the emperor at war councils, was unbearable for those who had sworn to defend Rome with their lives. In the provinces, like vultures sensing weakness, governors did not miss their chance. In distant Hispania, Pupienus openly declared his refusal to recognize the authority of an emperor steeped in sin and who had insulted the laws of gods and men. In Gaul, where pride and independence had always been in the blood of the legionaries, talk of finding a new worthy leader grew louder. And in the East, where family values and traditions were sacred, abhorrence for Maximinus reached its peak, threatening to escalate into open rebellion. Maximinus's audacious sacrilege, his trampling of ancient traditions and divine laws, united Rome in an unprecedented surge of solidarity. Senators, brave warriors, common plebeians, cult officiants, and provincial governors all were bound by a shared sense of indignation. The emperor, who dared to defy the very nature of things and the will of the gods, could no longer remain in power. Across the vast empire, the flames of rebellion were smoldering, ready to erupt. The decisive spark that ignited widespread anger flared in the spring of 238 AD. Just 2 months after the sacrilegious marriage, the legions, once jubilantly welcoming Maximinus, began to show signs of decay and disobedience. The detonator was an event that occurred at a military council in the imperial camp near Aquileia. Maximinus summoned his generals to devise a strategy for suppressing the brewing revolt. However, as a defiant provocation, he insisted that his imperial wife, veiled and in women's attire, along with his son Maximus, preside over the council, seated beside him. An oppressive silence, permeated with unspoken outrage, descended upon the tent, and then one man, filled with courage, dared to break this heavy silence. Marcus Pupienus Maximus, a distinguished general who had dedicated over 40 years of his life to military service, rose to his full height and spoke words full of dignity and contempt. "I do not recognize a woman in this military council, and I do not recognize as emperor a man who has lost all masculine dignity." These majestic words resonated like thunder, shaking the foundations of power. Maximinus, consumed by madness, ordered an immediate execution. However, this time something extraordinary occurred. The soldiers, tasked with carrying out the ill-fated order, displayed unprecedented disobedience. Not a single warrior moved, demonstrating contempt for the emperor's will. Tension in the camp reached its peak until the centurions declared their refusal to obey Maximinus. The military camp, hitherto submissive, was engulfed by a wave of mutiny. Standards, symbolizing loyalty to the emperor, were cast down in protest. The legions, having rebelled against the depraved ruler, proclaimed Pupienus and Balbinus as their new leaders, expressing hope for change. For the first time in Rome's history, an emperor was overthrown not due to the ambitious designs of another military commander, but due to the profound moral revulsion he had provoked in his own troops. News of the coup shook Rome like a spark falling into a powder keg. The Senate, emboldened by the army's rebellion, officially declared Maximinus an enemy of the state, stripping him of all legitimacy. One by one, the provinces joined in this fateful decision, demonstrating widespread contempt for the tyrant. Provincial governors tore up their oaths, and cities began hastily preparing to repel a possible attack by the deranged emperor. Surrounded on all sides by enemies, Maximinus made a decision filled with desperation and recklessness. If Rome did not wish to see him as its emperor, then the city must burn in the flames of his wrath. Betrayed by the Senate, rejected by most provinces, and even questioned by his own legions, Maximinus made a decision that would forever tarnish his name. He swore that if Rome rejected him, the city would be razed to the ground by his hand. The emperor ordered his remaining loyal troops to march on the capital and prepare for its merciless plunder, leaving no stone unturned. Even in this final act of defiance, when the emperor's power should seemingly have been unshakable, it began to crack. As his army advanced through Italy, Maximinus's forces dwindled due to increasing desertions. Those who had once trembled before his might now fled his camp under the cover of night. Others openly refused to proceed, muttering that they no longer followed a man, but a monster whose deeds had offended both gods and mortals. The culmination of this downfall was a tragic episode that occurred on 10th May 238 AD near Aquileia. That night, a detachment of praetorians, led by a centurion named Gessarius, stormed the imperial tent. The scene before them was like a sinister parody of conjugal intimacy. Maximinus and Maximus slept side by side, clad in wedding attire, which appeared blasphemous. The execution was swift and symbolic. The soldiers decapitated the emperor with the very sword he had so often used to crush his enemies. His severed head was sent to Rome as irrefutable proof of his demise. It was displayed for public viewing in the Forum, like a trophy, and then cast into the river Tiber, as if the city itself sought to rid itself of the oppressive burden of his memory. But Maximus's fate proved even more tragic. Freed from his father's physical power, he realized that the psychological shackles with which his father had bound him were unbreakable. His personality was so profoundly shattered that he lost the ability to see himself as a man or a worthy heir. Historians recount that he spent his final days in a state of complete confusion and despair, and eventually threw himself from a palace window in a desperate attempt to reclaim the only thing he had left, his lost human dignity. Thus ended the inglorious era of Maximinus Thrax and his offspring, Maximus. Instead of triumph, a shameful fiasco; instead of imperial grandeur, a tragedy of boundless power that crushed both the despot and his own son. The fall of Maximinus Thrax and the tragic fate of Maximus are not merely a dark page in the annals of Rome. They serve as an eternal reminder of what happens when power loses all boundaries and direction. The empire, which had witnessed many cruel, bloodthirsty, and even eccentric rulers, could not tolerate the greatest atrocity, the trampling of the sacred bonds of family and human dignity. Maximinus naively believed that brute force would make him invincible. But he forgot that no swords or legions can sustain a leader who has betrayed the fundamental values of his people. And his son, an innocent victim of this madness, serves as a bitter reminder that wounds inflicted upon personality, dignity, and soul are so profound that no victory, no liberation, and no end can ever truly heal them. At its core, this story is a warning echoing through the centuries. Unlimited power not only corrupts, but inevitably destroys. It can transform a brave warrior into a bloodthirsty tyrant, a loving father into a ruthless executioner, and a legitimate heir into a pathetic shadow of himself. This historical drama speaks not only of bygone days, it persistently warns of the challenges of modernity.